For 2 decades, Prince William was told that the shadows haunting his mother were merely figments of a troubled imagination. He was led to believe that the sensation of being constantly watched, analyzed, and recorded was nothing more than the paranoia of a woman under siege. But yesterday morning, amidst the freezing silence of Windsor, that narrative didn't just crack, it completely shattered. What Prince William discovered behind a sealed, water-damaged door at Royal Lodge, the residence of Sarah Ferguson, was not a collection of forgotten family trinkets. It was the vindication of Princess Diana's darkest fears. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not talking about old photo albums or dusty correspondence. According to high-level insiders, what the future king unearthed was effectively a black intelligence archive. We are talking about unauthorized audio transcripts, psychological profiles drafted by individuals with no medical authority, and most chilling of all, photographs taken from angles that prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that the photographer was standing inside the private sanctuaries of Kensington Palace. The discovery answers the single most terrifying question that has hung over the House of Windsor for 30 years. The eyes that were watching Diana were not just the paparazzi telephoto lenses from the street. They belonged to guests who had been invited in. This archive suggests a calculated, internal operation, a game of chess played by men in gray suits who used privacy as a weapon. And perhaps the most disturbing twist of all, these secrets were sleeping for 20 years under the roof of the Duchess of York. Was Fergie a conspirator, or merely a pawn in a game she never understood? And who exactly was holding the camera? The answers are darker than you can imagine, and the investigation begins right now. It was the sort of morning that felt almost suspended in time, the kind of stillness that often precedes a seismic shift in the atmosphere. The winter air hanging over the Windsor estate was biting and still, casting long, muted reflections against the ancient stone walls of the castle. Inside the warmth of his private study, Prince William had arrived earlier than usual, seeking that rare, fleeting commodity in a future king's life: silence. He sat with a cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals, preparing for a day of scheduled engagements, handshakes, and the stoic performance of duty. But the universe had a different script written for that Tuesday. The quiet was shattered not by a noise, but by an entrance. When his most trusted senior aide stepped into the room, there was no hurried rush of footsteps, no breathless panic. Instead, there was something far more alarming: a hesitation. The aide, a man trained to deliver bad news with the flatness of a weather report, looked visibly disturbed. He carried a folder, not tucked under his arm, but held with both hands as if it contained something radioactive. "Your Royal Highness," the aide began, his voice lowered to a register that signaled a code-red internal crisis. "We require a confidential moment, immediately." William, sensing the gravitational pull of the situation, closed the file in front of him. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply stood up. The air in the room seemed to tighten, the oxygen sucked out by the unspoken implication that the peace of the morning was over. The briefing that followed was not about state affairs or international diplomacy. It concerned a property just a few miles away, tucked within the lush, ivy-wrapped seclusion of the Great Park: Royal Lodge. For years, this sprawling residence had been the sanctuary of Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. To the public, it was a quiet retirement home for a woman who had weathered decades of tabloid storms. To the family, it was a place of warmth, chaotic dogs, and eccentric charm. But beneath that veneer of domestic eccentricity, something had been rotting. The previous day, a team of structural engineers had been conducting a routine inspection of the lodge's older wing, a section of the property that dated back centuries. The mandate was simple: check for damp, ensure the wiring was up to modern code, and reinforce the masonry. It was the most mundane task imaginable, until it wasn't. As maintenance staff worked their way through a corridor that had fallen into disuse, they encountered a door that didn't appear on the recent floor plans. It was an unassuming heavy oak door, swollen shut by years of humidity and neglect, located in a service passage that hadn't seen foot traffic in nearly 2 decades. When the workmen finally forced the timber frame to yield, the seal broke with a groan that sounded like history itself being disturbed. A plume of stale, musty air rushed out, the scent of paper, decaying cardboard, and secrets that had been left to ferment in the dark. The room inside was windowless, suffocatingly small, and piled high with shadows. But it wasn't empty. Stacked against the far wall, covered in a thick gray blanket of dust, were boxes. Not the organized, cataloged archival boxes of the royal collection, but a haphazard, chaotic mountain of storage crates, taped shut with an urgency that suggested they were hidden in a panic. The labeling was inconsistent, some scrawled in marker pen, others bearing coded stickers that didn't match any known palace filing system. The foreman of the crew, a man who had worked on the estate for 30 years, immediately halted the work. He didn't need to open them to know that this felt wrong. The energy in the room was heavy, almost hostile. He called security. Security called the palace. And now, the palace was telling William. As the aide relayed the details, the location of the room, the estimated age of the boxes, and the initial assessment of their contents, Prince William's reaction was not one of explosive anger. It was something far more terrifying to those who knew him. He went completely still. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This was the Windsor freeze, the cold, impenetrable armor that descends when a member of the family realizes they are under attack. But this wasn't an attack from the press, or a foreign adversary. This was a ghost rising from the floorboards of his own estate. "Sealed for 20 years?" William asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, sir," the aide confirmed. "Since the early 2000s, by the look of the dust." William walked to the window, looking out at the gray horizon. The timeline was devastating. The early 2000s. The aftermath of the crash. The inquests. The boy's teenage years. The era when the monarchy was at its most fragile, and when the leaks were at their most vicious. He realized, with a sinking pit in his stomach, that the routine inspection had just performed open-heart surgery on the family's darkest timeline. Royal Lodge, the home of his aunt, the place of summer barbecues and tea parties, had been hiding a tumor. "Secure the site," William ordered, turning back to the room. "No one enters. No one leaves. And get those boxes to the secure review suite. I want to know exactly what has been sleeping in the dark for 20 years." The morning was no longer suspended in time. The clock had started ticking on a bomb that had been set 2 decades ago, and Prince William was the only one who could defuse it. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare of halogen lights in the palace's secure archive suite, the boxes from Royal Lodge looked like artifacts from a shipwreck. They were swollen with damp, smelling of rot and time. The archivists, wearing white cotton gloves, moved with the grim precision of forensic pathologists. This was no longer an inventory check, it was an autopsy of the past. Prince William stood at the head of the steel table. He did not touch the materials himself. He watched. His presence in the room turned the air heavy, a silent pressure that made even the seasoned archivists hold their breath as they lifted the first lid. The top layer seemed deceptively mundane stacks of newspapers from the mid-90s, clipped and highlighted. But as the layers were peeled back, the true nature of the hoard began to reveal itself. The first item of concern was a series of notebooks. They were cheap, spiral-bound notepads, the kind you might buy at a corner stationer, yet their contents were explosive. The handwriting was unfamiliar to the royal archivists, cramped, jagged, and hurried. These were not official palace logs. They were surveillance logs. William leaned in as an archivist carefully turned the pages. The dates corresponded to the final, turbulent years of Princess Diana's life. The entries were chilling in their mundane cruelty. They didn't record state secrets. They recorded vulnerability. 14 hours. Subject remains in bedroom. Curtains drawn. Staff report crying. 16:30 hours. Subject made call to unauthorized number. Duration, 40, 2 minutes. Tone, distressed. As William read the fragments, a cold nausea settled in his gut. This was not the work of a concerned friend or a dutiful employee. This was the cold, clinical observation of a laboratory specimen. Someone had been tracking his mother's emotional disintegration not to help her, but to document it, to build a file, to weaponize her pain. The line between protection and stalking had not just been blurred, it had been erased. "Who wrote these?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a blade. "We don't know yet, sir," the lead archivist replied, his face pale. "The handwriting doesn't match any of the private secretaries from that era. This looks unofficial, off the books." But the notebooks were only the preamble. Beneath the paper stack lay a collection of cassette tapes. They were old TDK tapes, their plastic cases yellowed and cracked. Most were unlabeled, but a few bore cryptic initials written in marker. The audio equipment was brought in a vintage deck, sourced from the storage, specifically for this task. The mechanical clunk of the tape being inserted sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. William signaled for them to press play. For 10 seconds, there was only the hiss of magnetic static, the sound of empty air, and then a voice cut through the white noise. It was a voice William knew better than his own. It was his mother. She wasn't speaking to a crowd. She wasn't giving an interview. The acoustics were hollow, echoing slightly. It sounded like a drawing room, or perhaps a private sitting area. She was laughing at first, a bright, unguarded sound, and then her tone shifted to one of hushed anxiety. She was confiding in someone. "I don't know who to trust anymore. They listen at the doors. I can hear the floorboards creaking when I'm on the phone. The recording cut to a sharp click. The room was deathly silent. William's face was a mask of stone, but his hands, resting on the edge of the table, were white-knuckled. This was not a recording of a public event. This was a recording made without consent. The audio quality, muffled, with occasional rustling of fabric, suggested the microphone had been hidden, perhaps in a vase, under a sofa cushion, or worse, worn on the body of the person Diana was speaking to. The realization hit William with the force of a physical blow. His mother's paranoia, the very thing the men in gray suits had used to paint her as unstable, was actually a rational response to her reality. She was being listened to. The proof was spinning on a magnetic spool right in front of him, recovered from a moldy box in his aunt's attic. The archivists continued their grim work, pulling out folder after folder. There were psychological profiles drafted by people with no medical qualifications, amateur analyses of the princess's stability, seemingly written to justify, sideline her, or strip her of influence. There were transcripts of conversations between the young princes and their nanny, innocuous chats about school and toys, which had been typed up and filed away as intelligence. This was a shadow archive. It was a collection of leverage. It became terrifyingly clear that Royal Lodge had been used as a dump site. When the climate in the palace changed, when Diana passed, or when the inquiries began, someone had panicked. They couldn't destroy these files. Perhaps they were too valuable as insurance, but they couldn't keep them in the official archives. So, they found a place of chaos, a place where things got lost, a place occupied by a duchess known for her disorganized life. They hid the poison in Sarah Ferguson's pantry, betting that no one would ever look. William stared at the pile of tapes. He wasn't just looking at history. He was looking at a crime scene where the weapon was information, and the autopsy was far from over. The box at the bottom, the one sealed with heavy industrial tape, was yet to be opened, and if the tapes were the voice of the betrayal, the final box contained the vision of it. "Open the last one," William commanded. He needed to see it all. He needed to stare the devil in the face. The final box was different. It lacked the careless disorder of the others. It was smaller, reinforced at the corners, and sealed with a heavy-duty industrial tape that had dried into a brittle amber crust. While the previous boxes felt like a dumping ground for panicked secrets, this one felt deliberate. It felt like a trophy case. The lead archivist used a scalpel to slice through the aged adhesive. The sound of the tearing tape seemed deafening in the acoustic vacuum of the secure suite. He lifted the lid, revealing a layer of black foam padding. Beneath it lay not papers nor tapes, but a series of thick, manila envelopes. There was no writing on them, no dates, no names. With a nod from Prince William, the archivist opened the first envelope and slid the contents onto the stainless steel table. Photographs, dozens of them. But these were not the glossy, high-contrast shots of the paparazzi that William had spent his life loathing. Those images, as invasive as they were taken from the outside, looking in telephoto lenses, crushing the distance from a street corner or a bush's edge. These photos were different. The perspective was all wrong. The first image showed a corridor in Kensington Palace. It was a private hallway, leading to the nurseries. The lighting was dim, the grain of the film high, suggesting low-light conditions and no flash. In the frame, a young Prince Harry ran down the hall, a toy in hand, laughing. William stared at the photo. He knew that hallway. He knew the carpet. But what froze his blood was the angle. The photo had been taken from behind a partially open door of a staff cupboard. The black blur on the left side of the frame was the door frame itself. The photographer was hiding. The second photo was even more violation. It showed the family's private dining room. The table was set for a meal. Diana was seated, her head in her hands, her posture one of utter exhaustion. She was wearing a dressing gown. The angle was low, waist height. The camera hadn't been held up to an eye. It had been held low, perhaps concealed in a bag or under a jacket. It was a covert shot, taken by someone standing just a few feet away from her. Someone she had likely just welcomed into the room. Someone she trusted enough to be vulnerable in front of. "These were taken from the inside," William said, his voice devoid of emotion, a terrifying calm replacing the shock. "This isn't intrusion, this is infiltration." He picked up one of the photos, holding it by the edge. He studied the geometry of the shot. To get this angle, you had to be standing by the fireplace. Only staff or close friends were allowed by the fireplace. The collection grew more disturbing. There were shots of documents left on desks, letters from lawyers, private notes from the Queen photographed hurriedly, slightly out of focus, as if someone had snapped them while the occupant of the room was in the bathroom. This was industrial espionage carried out in a family home. But the kill shot the image that made the archivist look away in embarrassment. and made William's eyes darken with a fury that could burn down a kingdom, was in the last envelope. It was a photo of Diana's bedroom. The bed was unmade. A book lay on the nightstand. The room was empty, but the violation was absolute. The photo had been taken from the doorway, looking in. It was a surveyor's shot, scoping out the sanctuary where the most hunted woman in the world slept. Why? Was someone planning to plant something? Were they checking for hiding places? Or was it simply a sick power play, a way for the men in gray suits to prove that there was nowhere, absolutely nowhere, that she was safe from their gaze? William placed the photo down, face first. The silence in the room was suffocating. This archive proved that the security perimeter of Kensington Palace had been a myth. The threat hadn't been the photographers on motorbikes. It had been the invisible guests walking the halls with cameras hidden in their pockets. And for 20 years, the evidence of this betrayal had been sitting in a damp box at Royal Lodge, gathering mold while the world debated who was to blame for Diana's misery. These weren't taken by a stranger, William stated, looking up at his security chief. Strangers don't get into the bedroom. Strangers don't hide in the nursery cupboards. He pointed a finger at the pile of photos. I want to know the focal length of these lenses. I want to know the film stock. I want to know who was on the rota for the private apartments on the dates these were taken. Cross-reference every face, every name, every contractor. The shadows were no longer abstract concepts. They were real people. They had names. They had walked these halls. And they had left a trail. William realized that the enemy was not a monster under the bed. The enemy was the person who made the bed. And now, armed with the evidence from Sarah Ferguson's attic, he was going to hunt them down. The summons to Clarence House was not a request. It was a directive. When Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, received the call, the tone was polite but unmistakably firm. There were no pleasantries about the weather or the dogs, just a time and a location. Sarah arrived at the side entrance, bypassing the cameras. She wore a coat buttoned to the neck, her usual exuberant energy replaced by a nervous, palpable tension. She knew something had been found at the lodge. The workmen had been dismissed, security had swarmed the wing, and silence had descended over the estate. But she didn't know what had been found. She was ushered into a small, private drawing room. The curtains were drawn against the winter gray. Prince William was already there, standing by the fireplace, not leaning, just standing. He looked like a man carved from marble. "William?" she asked tentatively, stepping into the room. He didn't smile. He gestured to the chair opposite him. On the low table between them lay a single black folder. It was closed. "We need to talk about the storage room in the East Wing, Sarah," William said. His voice was not angry, but it carried the weight of the institution he represented. It was the voice of the crown, not the nephew. Sarah's hands fluttered to her lap. "The damp patch? The maintenance team said they found some old boxes. I assumed it was just junk. Old charity auction items, perhaps? Or Andrew's golf things?" William sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. He was scanning for deceit, for a flicker of recognition. It wasn't golf clubs. It was intelligence, surveillance, recordings of my mother, photos of the inside of Kensington Palace. Sarah's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the black folder, as if it were a venomous snake. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling. "In my house? William? I swear on my daughter's lives, I have never seen those things. Why would I? How could I?" "I believe you didn't know what was in them," William said, his tone softening by a fraction, but his gaze remaining intense. "But they got there somehow. Someone brought them into your home. Someone used your attic as a landfill for their secrets." He leaned forward. "Think back, Sarah. 20 years ago, the early 2000s. You were going through hell. The debts, the scandals, the chaotic entourage. Who was helping you pack? Who was managing your storage? Who brought you boxes and said, 'Just keep these here for a while, ma'am'?" Sarah pressed her fingers to her temples, her eyes squeezing shut. The memories of those years were a blur of stress and survival. She had been surrounded by fixers, advisors, financial aides, and friends who promised to make her problems go away. People came and went from Royal Lodge like a train station. There were so many, she whispered. There was that man who handled the archives, and the advisor from the city. And, oh God, a realization seemed to dawn on her, a memory of a favor asked, a truck arriving late at night. And for God's sake, change the locks. As the Duchess left, shaken and pale, William picked up the black folder. The link had been established. The shadows had used the family's own vulnerabilities against them. But now, the mule had spoken, and the path led straight back to the heart of the establishment. The room where Prince William convened his inner circle was technically a library, but by midnight, it had been transformed into a command center. Heavy oak tables were covered in digital tablets, timelines were taped to the silk wallpaper, and the air hummed with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a counterintelligence operation. There were no screaming matches. There was no throwing of vases. There was only the silent hunt. Opposite William sat the new head of palace security, a man recruited from MI5, and a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing assets that didn't want to be found. Together, they were building a map. The people who walked softly on the carpets, carried nondescript briefcases, and believed themselves to be the true guardians of the monarchy, largely independent of the family they served. They operated under a doctrine of protective surveillance, the chief explained. They convinced themselves that recording the princess, tracking her calls, and photographing her private rooms wasn't spying. It was risk management. They believed they needed leverage in case she went rogue. They were building a dossier to control the narrative. William stared at the web of names. He recognized some of them. Men who had smiled at him at Christmas parties. Men who had offered him advice on his gap year. Men who had sworn loyalty to his father. And the connection to Sarah? William asked, his voice low. She was the blind spot, the accountant interjected. This network knew that Sarah Ferguson was financially vulnerable and administratively chaotic. They befriended her. Late that night, William left the command center and walked through the silent corridors to the king's private study. Charles was awake, reading by a solitary lamp. The king looked up, seeing the darkness in his son's eyes. William laid the map of the network on the desk. He didn't need to explain it. Charles knew. He had lived through the wars of the 90s. He had felt the sting of the gray suits himself. The leaks, the briefings against him, the sense that the institution was fighting its own members. They think they are the crown, and we are just the tenants, Charles said softly, looking at the names. They believe they protect the institution from the fallibility of the humans inside it. But in doing so, they become the rot. I want them gone, William said. Not just fired. I want them erased from the contact books. I want their access codes revoked, their pensions frozen where legally possible, and their influence severed. I want to know who they are talking to now. Charles nodded. He understood that this was William's rite of passage. To be king, one must first master the machine. Be careful, William, Charles warned. You cannot declare war on the machinery openly. If you drag them into the light, they will release the rest of the files. They will burn the house down to save themselves. You must do this quietly. You must be the ice, not the fire. William took the advice. He returned to the command center with a new directive. We do not go to the police, William announced to his team. That would create the circus they want. We handle this internally. We are going to conduct a system reset. The order was given to initiate a silent purge. Over the next few hours, the team began the process of deplatforming the network. Old security passes were remotely deactivated. Digital access to archival servers was cut for retired staff who still held consultancy roles. A list of persona non grata was drawn up, names that would never again be allowed through the gates of Windsor, Kensington, or Buckingham Palace. But the most chilling part of the night came when the security chief identified the architect, the man likely responsible for taking the photos in the bedroom. He's still active, sir, the chief said, hesitating. He's currently working as a strategic advisor for a firm that handles media relations for the Sussexes. The room went dead silent. The web didn't just reach back into the past, it stretched across the ocean. The gray suits hadn't disappeared. They had just found new clients. The archive at Fergie's house was just the backup drive. The main operation was still running. William looked at the name on the screen. The realization was absolute. This wasn't just about justice for Diana anymore. This was about survival for the future. Keep watching him, William ordered, and find out what else he took. The discovery at Royal Lodge was not the end of the mystery. It was the key that unlocked a door to a much larger, darker room. And Prince William had just stepped inside, locking the door behind him. The discovery at Royal Lodge has done far more than just expose a 20-year-old secret. It has fundamentally rewritten the psychology of the future king. Prince William entered that room as a man burdened by the past, chasing the ghosts of his mother's tragedy. He left it as something else entirely. He has become the gatekeeper. The era of the soft monarchy where access was easy, where trust was given freely, and where forgotten addicts could harbor dangerous secrets is officially over. By securing the Shadow Archive, William has sent a silent, chilling message to every courtier, every aide, and every distant relative. The house is being cleaned, and the new landlord has a long memory. He has learned the hardest lesson of all. The greatest threat to the crown does not come from the screaming headlines of the tabloid press. but from the quiet scratching of pens in the back offices of the palace itself. The men in gray suits who sought to control Diana by documenting her every breath have been put on notice. Their insurance policy has been seized. Their hiding place has been burned. But as the heavy oak doors of the secure archive slide shut, locking away the tapes and the photographs forever, one terrifying question remains hanging in the cold Windsor air. We know what was in the boxes. We know where they were hidden. But we still don't know the full extent of the distribution.